Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning into another Supatease video. World of Warcraft is back, and it is banging. I was able to play yesterday on the first day of the pre-release for around 8 hours and get to max level on my main character, being my druid. And in today's video, I wanted to discuss 4 major points that Blizzard is absolutely knocking out of the park with this expansion to really show you what you're getting in terms of value from the game. Those 4 subjects are going to be the zones, the leveling, world PvP and the improvements that have been made to it, the dungeons, and I think most importantly, the story and the narrative. Now, when we get to that final section, I will give you a warning for any spoilers. If you don't want anything ruined from the story and you want to experience that yourself in real time, I will let you know before we go into detail with anything related to that. But it's kind of integral to the discussion that we bring up some points about the story that are really making this expansion and likely the Soul Saga stand out from other World of Warcraft expansions. So the first major point of discussion is going to be the zones and the leveling. Now, in this expansion for the War Within, they are taking it a different direction. As opposed to being a static flat island, we will be digging down into the center of Azeroth, and this brings with it a really epic feeling when you're going down all of these deep trenches and the ceiling is closing in on you with every zone that you get deeper and deeper into. It creates a completely different atmosphere than I've experienced in a lot of other expansions, to which I have really enjoyed. But just because we are going underground doesn't mean that things can't also be beautiful. Hallowfall is by far one of the most immaculate zones I have ever experienced in the War Within, with a giant crystal in the sky rotating between light and darkness and completely shifting the dynamics of the zone. This was by far my favorite zone to explore and interact with. The leveling this time around has improved as well, albeit I think tying in more directly with a fantastic story. You don't feel like you're grinding as much as you may have felt in previous expansions, but the process is also accelerated. I personally found the fastest way to level being using the random dungeon finder, ideally being a tank or a healer for the faster queue times, and getting around close to 100,000 to 150,000 XP per 5 minutes, as most of these dungeons are really quick and dirty. You get in there, you get the action, and you get out. They do not waste any of your time, but they are also exciting and dynamic as well in that very small 5-minute period. So I very much so have been enjoying the leveling. I would recommend that you do at least complete the campaign on one character, and obviously depending on your goals in the game. If you're focused on PvE, you may want to do it on alts as well. If you're focused on PvP, you don't need to do it so much, but I really liked this accelerated pace, and mingling in with the story made it feel like it wasn't as much of a grind. Which brings us into our second point of discussion for why the War Within is awesome, which is world PvP. Now, I think one of the biggest complaints for Dragonflight World PvP, and probably for some time at this point, is that tanks are really oppressive, and I really don't think that is going to be the case anymore. I did some Guardian Druid for testing to see if it was going to be as powerful as it was in Dragonflight when I gave it some coverage at that time, and it was noticeably weaker. I took some encounters and some 1v1s that I feel like in previous iterations of the game I would have more than easily been able to come out on top, and I was not able to. It seems like tanks are a lot easier in order to secure kills against, and they're a lot less oppressive in terms of their survivability, which is a big improvement from previous iterations of World PvP. One of the first things that I did when I got to max level is immediately scour the map to find a world PvP quest, as this was one of my favorite things to do at the start of Dragonflight, and I was able to find one. But of course, with it being pre-release and me grinding out to max level really fast, there weren't a lot of players there, but I was able to figure out that basically this quest is very similar to the duck quest from Dragonflight, which is probably the crowd favorite, I think. You guys let me know what your favorite world PvP quest is, but on this PvP quest, you're going to be able to kill creatures and mount them, and they give you knockback effects that you can send players just totally off of these cliffs, which have a lot less water density than before. So your likelihood of surviving a lot of these knockoffs is going to be pretty low, likely making for some very entertaining engagements. Now, when it comes to dungeons, my favorite was the Priory of Sacred Flames, a more modern take on the Scarlet Crusade and those fanatics. They took some big risks with this dungeon, particularly infusing undead creatures with the power of the light, which I was absolutely not anticipating, with some throwbacks to Blaine Whitemane back in Scarlet Cathedral, where they resurrect some of the earlier bosses into undead holy versions of themselves. I loved the layout. I loved the aesthetic. This is exactly what I would have expected for the next modernization of the Scarlet Crusade. Which brings us to the final part and the spoiler-filled part. So this is your warning at this time. If you do not want any elements of this story spoiled to you and you want to experience that on your playthrough, I totally respect that. And you should probably stop watching the video at this point. But now that we have given that warning, let's get into the story and let's get into the narrative. Now, I have been a long-term World of Warcraft nerd, dating back all the way to Warcraft 3, with being one of my most historic and memorable moments being Gromosh and Thrall going up against Manarov, and Gromosh making this heroic sacrifice in order to free his people and establishing a legacy for his son Garrosh. I was absolutely sold on this universe at that moment in time, but unfortunately in more recent expansions, I think particularly Shadowlands, the narrative went in this cosmic direction that broke my immersion with the story, so much so that I kind of checked out at that point. But with The War Within, it is totally not the case. I felt absolutely like we were back on track with the original essence of Warcraft. And the first moment that I noticed that was the sacrifice of Khadgar and the destruction of Dalaran. The fact that they were willing to destroy Dalaran and showcase Khadgar with a heroic, selfless act in teleporting Illyria out at the final second reminded me so much so of that moment with Gromosh and Thrall. And what it did was it really set up this anticipation for the rest of the leveling experience, that if they were going to just destroy and demolish Dalaran and kill off one of the major characters immediately, what else was going to happen in this expansion? And it divulged itself in a huge amount of directions after this that I could not believe going through. I was constantly on the edge of my seat, especially when we got cinematics with Magni Bronzebeard, and I'm thinking, no, please do not, we're not doing that. I mean, sure, this guy, I didn't like him when he was telling me about the wounds and stuff, but you can't take Magni too. You can't do that to me. And I was sitting there through the cinematic the entire time, not certain if they were going to, considering how impactful that first cinematic was. Thankfully, they didn't. Magni does survive, but he is cleansed of being the speaker for Azeroth, and now that's leaving a lot of unanswered questions as to what is going to happen next for him. What is going to be his role, and what does it mean now that Azeroth does not have a speaker, which is great. I love having these unanswered questions. It means that there's more room for the story to grow into the future. It felt like every zone left enough room to breathe and really establish and bring characters forward, much like Anduin and his interactions with Farron, and how he's going to reestablish his connection with the light moving forward. Not to mention later after this moment, him getting kidnapped by the Nerubians, and me thinking again immediately, thanks to that first cinematic with Khadgar, like, are they really taking Anduin away from us now? Like, this poor guy just gets kidnapped more than Princess Peach does in the Mario franchise, and I just couldn't believe it. But then later on we free him, and then that tension is released, and then finally culminating into the final zone, with Illyria taking on Xal'atath one-on-one and showing that the development and the ability to hone in the power of the void in a way that is more controllable was remarkable. I loved the layout of the story, giving each zone enough room for each character to breathe and leaving tons of surprises, considering this is just the initial launch of the expansion and it's a trilogy of a Soul Saga, has left me filled with anticipation, which is something that I was missing for a while. I feel like Warcraft is put back into World of Warcraft. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and this discussion and these points. Let me know what you think in terms of your own experience or things that you have seen. What has got you excited for the beginnings of the Soul Saga?